Hi, I'm Rumplick, and my research question is, does chitosan or cinnamon oil work more effectively at increasing the spoiling time of dairy products? So in our current society today, one of the biggest issues that we're facing is with food spoilage and food excess, and a study done by the National Research Defense Council actually found that about 40% of the food that we produce in the US ends up going to waste. And this is a serious quantity of food because it ends up equating to about 133 billion pounds of food total every single year. So this amount of food is actually enough to fill the entire Empire State Building all the way up a total of 91 times, just to show that the amount of food that we're wasting is extremely significant, and it is something that we need to fix. So even though we are wasting so much food and we do have so much food excess, a study done again by the NRDC found that we actually waste about people are experiencing about 1 in 8 who can't provide food for their family on a daily basis. And this is a serious problem, mostly because of the economic issues that buying food causes. Specifically, a family of 4, it could cost about $150 to $300 weekly just to feed your family. And then over a course of a year, that family of 4 is also expected to lose about $3,000 in wasted food alone. So this $3,000 is extremely significant because it could be used for things such as buying materialistic goods like new technology, paying off bills or debt for your car or your house, or for other expenses just as like making a college fund for your child. So another problem we're also facing in the food production industry is with the dairy industry specifically, and this is because of the environmental impacts that the dairy industry has. So specifically in the US alone, we use about 270 million dairy cows every single day just to produce the amount of dairy that we require. And each one of these cows is having a very big environmental impact on the environment. So specifically, this is with climate change. Each cow releases cows overall reduce about 14.5% of our total methane emissions in our atmosphere. And this is extremely significant because it shows that cows are one of the biggest producers of methane, but we have such a dense population of them in the US that it's causing serious problems. Just to give you a little bit of a visual, cows such as the Western cattle produce about 120 kilograms of methane per day, whereas a human only produces about 0.12 kilograms of methane per day, proving that the dairy industry does have extreme environmental problems. So far, scientists have been looking into ways that we could not only make immediate changes to fix these issues, but also permanent changes, because the immediate changes obviously won't be able to last long term. So some immediate changes that were made were specifically new freezing techniques and new transportation techniques, because by putting these into place, they would be sure that the food would be arriving to the consumer in the freshest condition possible. But even though that is helping a lot, it's actually proven that once the food arrives to the consumer, it still has the possibility to just be wasted and to go bad, so it's not a permanent solution. However, coatings are something that researchers and scientists have been looking into that could be implemented into mass production right before the food is packaged up, and it would allow for the food to be in the freshest condition when it does reach the consumer and stay in that condition for a longer period of time. And the two most popular ingredients that I've seen being used in these coatings are chitosan and cinnamon oil, and they both have been proven to increase spoiling time. So specifically, cinnamon oil is typically used in daily life for therapeutic purposes and flavoring techniques. However, a study done by Scientarium Technology in 2015 and a similar study done by Veterinary World in 2016 found that when combining cinnamon oil with things such as raw chicken breast or yogurt, it has the ability to increase the spoiling time by almost double. And along with this, chitosan also had similar results. Used in daily life, it's from the exoskeleton of crustaceans and other types of fungi, and usually it is used to hinder fat production and to help with weight loss. However, a study done by the International Journal of Polymer Science and another study done by the same researcher for the Journal of Pure and Applied Chemistry in 2015 and 2016 found that when combining chitosan with a type of Japanese mango and then combining a mixture of chitosan and cinnamon oil with the same type of Japanese mango, it had the ability to increase the spoiling time as well. So for my specific experiment, I chose to perform experimental research because I would be able to test the effectiveness of chitosan and cinnamon oil against each other instead. So by doing this, I wanted to test them specifically on dairy products so I'd be able to see what effect this would have on the dairy industry, and maybe if I got my results right, I would be able to increase the spoiling time of dairy products, which would help us to produce less dairy and therefore help with the environmental issues that the dairy industry causes. So by doing this, I was able to determine which one was a more effective solution and which one we can incorporate into food production. And specifically in my experiment, I had to do the experimental research because it allowed me to implement certain controls into my experiment that I needed in order to make sure that the chitosan and the cinnamon oil would be tested under specific conditions. So for my experiment specifically, I first had to start off by making these coatings, and they both had to have specific types of binding agents. So for chitosan, it was glycerol, and for cinnamon oil, it was polysorbate 80. And for each type of coatings, I made different ratios of binding agent to ingredient in order to have just different tests that I can have. So for each of the ratios, I did ratios of 1 to 1, 1 to 2, and 2 to 1 for the binding agent to the ingredient. I then applied these coatings to 2 samples for each coating, and then I had my specific controls. So for my controls, I had one control that was just 2 samples that were just receiving polysorbate 80, 2 that were receiving just glycerol, and then 2 that were receiving no treatment. I then left these samples unrefrigerated for a period of 3 weeks and left them on top of a shelf so they would be undisturbed, and I took photos of the mold growth about every 5 days. And then I evaluated these photos in a computer program called ImageJ, which is able to measure the surface area of the mold growth. So this graph is just meant to represent only my controls and what results I got from them, because I actually didn't get any mold growth on any of the samples that had the chitosan or the cinnamon oil on them. So as you can see, the blue and the orange line actually represent my controls, whereas as you can see, they had the most mold growth, which was to be expected because they had no coating on it at all. However, my polysorbate 80 and my glycerol, which is represented by the gray and the darker orange line, they did actually have the ability to increase spoiling time because, as you can see by the graph, they didn't produce as much mold as the controls did. So, like I said, obviously the samples that received no treatment did grow the most mold, and the polysorbate 80 and the glycerol samples actually do have the ability to increase spoiling time, which will be useful for future knowledge. And just to further prove what I said before, these are all my cinnamon oil and chitosan samples, cinnamon being in the top left and chitosan being in the bottom right. And as you can see, none of them really had any mold growth on them, proving that both chitosan and cinnamon oil are equally as effective at increasing the spoiling time. So throughout my experiment, even though I did come to a valuable conclusion, there were some faults that I ran into along the way, and specifically the first one would be that I didn't refrigerate my samples. So the reason I didn't do this was because of the time restraints I had. However, if I were to repeat this experiment, or if somebody else were to repeat this, I would suggest that they did refrigerate the samples, because it's more of a realistic environment for the consumer to be keeping cheese in, since most likely they would be refrigerating it. And also, cinnamon oil actually has an extremely pungent taste and smell, as you can probably guess, and so that kind of had some impacts on my results, because a study done by Scientarium Technology, the one that I was talking about before with the cinnamon oil and the yogurt, actually found that when the highest possible concentration of cinnamon oil that allowed for it to be undetectable by taste and smell by the consumer wasn't enough to actually allow for any increase in boiling time. And from my own observations, I saw that my samples were extremely pungent in smell, so I think that my specific coating wouldn't be able to be used in our daily life. So the contributions to society that this has is, first, cinnamon sensory characteristics do make it the less desirable coating to be introduced into our production, because of that, I think chitosan would be the better option because it's both flavorless and tasteless and it doesn't have a smell. So if we are able to implement something like chitosan coatings into our production, just a 25% decrease in the amount of food that we're wasting will allow for about 795 million people to be fed overall, which will not only help with our current issue with famine, but also it will help with people who, it will help make cheeses and other products last longer. So the people that are just wasting their food, it will be lasting longer and give them a longer time to consume it. And also, because this specifically worked on dairy, I believe that if we're able to implement this into the dairy industry, specifically, it will have the ability to increase the spoiling time of dairy products, which will help us both to decrease the methane emissions that we're experiencing and help with global climate change. So also with new research, since this research could potentially be used later on in experiments, what this research contributes would be specifically that since cinnamon did have the ability to increase spoiling time, even though high concentrations of it wouldn't be considered desirable, I think that researchers could continue to research different concentrations of cinnamon oil. Since it does have the ability, it should be tested further just to see what it can do. And then also, since my binding agents actually did have the ability to increase boiling time, I think that they should be further tested because both glycerol and polysorbate 80 are commonly used in food production today as binding agents for other types of food. So if they're able to increase the spoiling time, they could just be applied onto foods additionally, and it would be a lot easier instead of incorporating something such as cinnamon oil or chitosan into the coatings as well.
Thank you, Meg.
How was the method you chose aligned with the purpose of your research, and which methods did you consider and reject?
So for my methods, I specifically did experimental research because I felt that that would be the best aligned with my experiment. For my experiment, I wanted to take both chitosan and cinnamon oil and test them against each other. And there have been multiple studies that were done on both chitosan specifically, cinnamon oil specifically, and them together, like I said before. But I could have data mined or used meta-analysis to kind of take the results of both those experiments and combine them. But I didn't really know if those experiments would be done under the same conditions, and in order to test something to see if it is truly effective against something else, it has to be under the same controls. So by using experimental research, I was able to specifically put in these controls to make sure that whichever one was more effective would be considered more effective.
Which additional questions emerged during your research? And then as a follow-up question, based on your experience, what advice would you give to other researchers who may choose to investigate those new questions?
Well, in my experiment, I specifically did mine on dairy products because dairy is the second commonly most wasted food. However, fruits and vegetables are actually the first. And because of this, I would like to see how these coatings actually work with things such as fruits and vegetables because they typically do tend to go bad very quickly. So if we're able to implement this, we can actually see the effects. But for further research, I would suggest that, like I said before, the researchers do refrigerate the samples because mostly produce ends up being refrigerated, and that would help it to last longer, and you would also get more realistic effects and a more realistic conclusion.
Okay, thank you.
Think about the initial curiosity that led to your inquiry. What other areas of inquiry might that same curiosity lead to?
Well, my initial inquiry for this curiosity for this entire experiment was pretty much I learned that food spoilage was such a big issue. I didn't really know how big of an issue it actually was. And coatings came out of that research because I was looking up things that they've been trying to do to fix this. So even though coatings was the option that I chose to do my research on, there was actually other experiments done where instead of coating food, they combined it with certain ingredients to make it last longer. And I think that would be really interesting. And yeah, I think if we implemented it, it would be cool, and it would help us to figure out what can we do in society to maybe instead of it wouldn't be able to coat it, but it would be inside of it, so it would make it a lot easier and more effective.
Thank you, Meg.
Thank you.